Welcome to the Plagues Project.
And Plagues, many angles.
Now more than ever.
Come learn with us.
I'm very excited to reflect a little bit on what our classical traditional sources have to offer us in this time of COVID-19 and the pandemic, which is visiting us truly like a plague and putting every one of us in a situation of strain. Of course, everyone's circumstances are different, and some people are feeling the impact and the strain of the pandemic more than others. But regardless, we're in an era in which we're confronting head on what it is to be human, what are the relationships that constitute us, how to go about living as long as we have this awareness now of our interdependence, and how to handle this awareness of dependence in light of the fact that we've organized our lives, at least until now, often with the assumption of our relative independence from one another. So it's a really challenging time, and many of us are thinking about what it is to be a person in relation to others. And the social distancing that we're experiencing is only making us more aware of how significant social relations are in making us who we are. Regardless of the variations of practices globally in facing this pandemic, there's the case that more and more of us are becoming more limited in our social environments, and the household, the place where you sleep and eat most of your meals, has really become the single site of one's social life. And this cropping of our social experience to the household context, well, first of all, it's devastating because most households, let's just say in the US, assume a whole network of kind of auxiliary spaces that the household relies upon: school, care facilities, social facilities, and in the case of religious life, the shul and Beit Midrash, and all of the additional places that we rely upon for an infusion of meaning, of inspiration, or we rely on these spaces for care for the dependents in the household. So we're dealing with a really kind of a suddenly very narrow domain for our social and religious lives. What I'd like to talk about in this short time is the fact that the household has always been the premier site for Jewish practice. So the kind of diminished access that we have right now to the full set of environments for Jewish life is not quite as devastating as one might think, given the fact that the household is the domain in which so much of halakha, of Jewish law, is lived out. So one way to look at this, and this is certainly a case of trying to find a silver lining or the glass is half full, is that halakha and traditional Jewish practices continue to have the premier domain of the household, and can indeed provide us with some nourishment and some sense of purpose and structure, even in a time of pandemic. Now, it's not so simple, because while it is true that halakha, there's a tremendous attraction right now for what traditional practices can offer us in such a time of disarray. So halakha, as Abraham Joshua Heschel famously talks about, how the laws of Shabbat help to construct a palace of time, that you can kind of step into this enchanted circle of Shabbat by taking up certain traditional practices. So that is available to us even in the time of pandemic and has a tremendous attraction. And it could be the tiniest ritual act can transform the very mundane and repetitive reality of being at home into something broken up and something sacred. And so halakha has a tremendous appeal right now to us in our very isolated environments. At the same time, because of the strain of this moment, because all of our activities now are so careful and measured, because we're considering, of course, the health implications of where should I shop? When should I shop? How do I stock my pantry to make sure that I have enough? What kinds of meals can I prepare given the limits of this time? It is quite difficult, given the fact that our actions are right now under so much strain, to shape them further with halachic consideration. So I do also want to mention that there's a way in which the pandemic we're living in right now can have the effect of kind of eroding halachic sensibilities, as if to say that when you make the ritual alterations to your everyday life through the practice of halakha, all along, without our knowing it, what was required was a kind of backdrop of the routine of everyday life. That backdrop is gone. And now even the most mundane activities like going shopping is very fraught. So the question is there really room for the halachic alterations or conditioning of our actions when right now they're being directed by the health concerns and public safety concerns given the situation of the pandemic? So that's the issue. Halakha has so much to offer us right now. And at the same time, do we have the psychological and emotional capacities to carry forward with halachic practice given the deprivations and the strain of this time? And there's no answer to that tension. And I think to myself how each person is very quietly and in their own way making those calculations, finding, like I think about it in terms of the Hanukkah miracle, finding a little jar of oil, that motivation to persist in the traditional life, and that then lighting that one day provides light for 8 days. And that's been my experience, speaking personally in the pandemic, that when I felt that I just don't have the emotional capacity to build the sukkah or to kind of create the sacred time, if I'm lucky enough to kind of piece together little scraps of emotional and physical energy to build the sukkah, then I can inhabit it and enjoy the bracha and the blessing that comes from living in the ritual forms that we've inherited and that have developed over so many millennia. So that has been the household and the ways in which halachic practice can inspire us in a time of such deprivation, can link us up into this broader arc of history, while also linking us up into a web of a community. It's an amazing, almost like a lifesaver that's thrown to us, and that we should grab onto. Eitz chaim hi lamachazikim ba. It is a tree of life for those who can hold on to it, but it does require a kind of intensity of motivation in a time of so much strain. Now, in my own scholarship, I've been very interested in the role of the household, not only as a place for halachic observance, but also as a point of origin for halachic observance. And I like to think about how important the domestic context has been in all of Jewish history, including Israelite history, which is something that can be overlooked when instead of thinking about the household and its importance, people think more about the, I guess you could say, the kind of, what I want to say, the ivory tower context of Jewish cultural production, like, say, rabbinic circles in late antiquity. When the twin settings of, say, the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, or the rabbinic academy end up kind of standing in for all of Jewish cultural life, what we lose out on is the, in my view, reality that all along are important Jewish cultural activities in the household context. I'd love to give one example of how it is that the household is a point of origin for what come to be recognized as formal Jewish practice or halachic practice. And it amazes me, in one case, what it took for me to finally come to the realization. But for those of you who observe a relatively traditional Shabbat observant life, you're familiar with the hectic minutes before candlelighting time, when the house has to be put in order and any use of electronic devices has to be concluded, and the decision has to be made where to turn on the lights that will be on for the entirety of Shabbat, or if you're going to set a Shabbat clock so that the light is on for the desired time. So you're running around and you're setting up the lights for Shabbat. And it occurred to me that, of course, the Shabbat candles were just that. Shabbat candles were, in all likelihood, the step that needs to be taken in order to make sure that after the sun went down, you had enough light in the household to actually continue with a lot of household work that does not conclude when Shabbat begins, but also so that the environment is lit for the leisure of Shabbat, for the meal that would be had, to bring shalom bayit, to bring the peacefulness to the home on Shabbat. So lighting candles was a practical accommodation to the reality that you weren't permitted to light fires and after the onset of Shabbat. And it's no great surprise that that ritual took on ceremonial significance at some point. By the time you get to the Mishnah, the rabbis assume that a woman head of household is kindling lamps before the onset of Shabbat. And it took on a halachic significance. But at first, it was actually a kind of important household operation, more so than any kind of religiously prescribed action. I made a similar realization on a Friday afternoon just in the last few years. I've never been one to bake, I will admit, but in my household, we drink homemade almond milk on a regular basis. And on Fridays, this means I have to make double the milk because I can't make that milk on Shabbat. And so every Friday before Shabbat, I'm looking to say, oh my goodness, we don't have that second jug of milk. And I get the almonds in the blender and I make it. And I have these two wonderful servings of milk that I put in the fridge for Shabbat. And then I think, oh my goodness, of course you have 2 loaves of bread on Friday for Friday night because you can't prepare food on Shabbat. And so even the notion of lechem mishnah has its origins in the household accommodation to the prohibition of food preparation and cooking on Shabbat. And that notion of the double portion is already reflected in the Torah account of the people of Israel when they're in the desert and the double portion of man falls on Friday. Behind that story of the man is the household activity and work that goes into double food preparation on Friday in advance of Shabbat. So those are 2 examples of how relatively iconic, central, significant aspects of Shabbat observance, lighting candles and having 2 portions of bread on Friday night, have their origins in household custom and kind of procedure, but that then took on the sacred status of ritual. And I invite you to consider any number of household activities that attained ritual status over time in the Jewish tradition, just as a way to consider how central the household is in the understanding of Jewish history over time. In fact, archaeologists of ancient Israel rely almost entirely on domestic findings in order to determine whether a given household was part of an Israelite community whether they find that there's an absence of pig bones or a preponderance of stoneware. These are the ways in which archaeologists find, oh, this household probably had an Israelite affiliation. And so I invite you to think about the fact that while the other environments for Jewish life, the synagogue, the house of study, or even more broadly, the neighborhood shops, these are all very important contexts for Jewish life. But in the time of pandemic, when all of these locations have been really diminished, and all that remains is the household, we can take some comfort in the fact that the household has always been the premier site for Jewish activity. And so its heightened importance right now can be met with halachic practice. And in fact, halachic practice can help to enhance our household life right now in a time of so much deprivation. I think that we're really at a moment of reckoning right now as a species. We're trying to figure out how we can behave with kindness and responsibility with one another, how we can preserve the well-being of our planet and of our communities. And we're looking around to utilize every tool, every means at our disposal to make some sense of things. And the Jewish people have inherited a set of practices that can awaken in any moment a sense of connection to one another in the present, to our people in the past, and to the divine. And being limited to the household context does not foreclose the possibility of a halachic life. And in fact, the household is the central Jewish institution, even from the times of ancient Israel. So the challenge really is how to maintain significant commitment and practice in a time of so much strain and deprivation. And the one thought I have on that is that we very much need one another to kind of lift our hearts in a time when we feel just that we're going to collapse into the conditions of the moment. Somebody, a friend, a family member who can kind of inspire us to take a religious action up is absolutely essential. And hopefully then the benefits of the practice can be received.